of Psychological Sciences at Rice University. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And before joining the University of Pennsylvania, she completed her PhD in psychology and neuroscience at Duke University. Dr. Sinclair is a cognitive neuroscientist, and she studies how people update their memories, beliefs, and behaviors in the lab and in real-world settings. Her research interests include knowledge and belief updating, learning from error, risk communication, information seeking and information sharing, and misinformation correction. And to conduct this highly interdisciplinary research, she uses a combination of both in-lab and online behavioral studies, of functional neuroimaging approaches, and also large-scale online field studies. And so today, he is going to talk about motivational states and how they bias choices, information consumption, and memory. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Allie Sinclair. Very, very much looking forward to your talk.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Zita, and thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to share some of my work with you and excited to join this community. I think it's great to connect and share out among people who are studying motivated cognition. A quick introduction for myself. As was just stated, I'm currently a postdoc here at Penn, but will be starting my lab at Rice next year. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training, and I study how motivation shapes learning and memory, as well as adaptive behavior change in real-world settings. And I'm really passionate about bridging basic science with applied contexts to help us address some of these pressing societal challenges that we see today. For example, related to climate change, public health crises, or the spread of misinformation online. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do and how I do it, you can check out my brand new lab website. I am recruiting graduate students this year. So if you have undergrads in your lab or postdocs who are looking for positions, please do spread the word. Broadly speaking, I take a sort of hub and spoke approach to my research program. So the hub is looking at these foundational mechanisms of motivated cognition, for example, by using psychological experiments and functional neuroimaging. And I look at how we can leverage those mechanisms in interventions that are generalizable and relevant across domains. For example, I apply this to develop interventions that can change health beliefs and behaviors, improve student learning and well-being, and motivate action to address climate change. Today, I'm going to share two projects that touch on these two domains down here. A quick roadmap before I dive in. In the first half of my talk today, I'll share a project where we looked at reward learning, looking at how motivational states bias the choices we make and the memories that we form. And in the second half of my talk, I'll apply some insights from part one to a relatively new project where we looked at how the affective framing of news headlines about climate change shapes how people engage with that information and what they remember later on. So without further ado, let's jump right into part one on reward learning. Here, I'll be sharing some findings from this paper, which came out a couple of years ago. And this was one of the projects that I conducted during graduate school, working with Allison Adcock at Duke. I want to start here with a big picture question. What motivates us to learn? Imagine that you posed that question to 3 of your students and got 3 very different answers. Some may be motivated by intrinsic curiosity. They're excited to explore a topic. Others may be driven by a fear of failure, and still others may be intently striving for success. Now, under one framework of motivation, we can think about these sentiments in different ways. We can consider curiosity a form of interrogative motivation, which drives us to explore and discover. Conversely, these other 2 sentiments, although they might seem pretty different on the surface, could potentially both reflect what we call imperative motivation, which drives us to address urgent, salient goals. And I want to note here that I'm conceptualizing motivation as an affective state that's linked to a particular goal. So let's dive into those states a little bit more. Imperative motivation is like urgent mode. It helps us to address urgent threats or goals like avoiding danger or winning a competition. But it leads to a kind of tunnel vision. It constrains the focus of attention and memory. And this can actually impair memory for some peripheral details. So although we might potentially see focal enhancements of central details of a threat or a goal, we might actually see blurring or forgetting of peripheral associative details. In the brain, this is associated with noradrenergic modulation and engagement of the amygdala and cortical MTL systems as opposed to the hippocampus proper. In contrast, interrogative motivation is like explore mode. It supports curiosity and exploration to help us find rewards and prepare for future-oriented goals. And it leads to a broader, more expansive focus for attention and memory. And this can enhance long-term associative memory formation. In the brain, dopaminergic modulation and engagement of the ventral tegmental area and the hippocampus. But there's a caveat in that the prior studies that had informed this theoretical framework, drawing on evidence from animal models as well as humans, had primarily focused on contrasting threat versus reward, as these are very potent levers that we can pull to potentially induce these motivational states. But there was a crucial untested prediction, which is that threat and reward is not the only way to induce these motivational states. For example, if I am participating in a competition and I feel really intense about it, that could be an example of imperative motivation where I'm striving for an objectively positive outcome. I want to achieve those rewards. Or conversely, morbid curiosity is an example of interrogative motivation about a negatively valenced stimulus. And so the idea is that there could be potentially multiple levers we could pull to induce these different states, and it's not only about threat and reward, that's just one way to do it. So in this study, we wanted to test whether we could nudge people into these motivational states while keeping the incentives constant. To do this, we used some narrative nudges by varying the cover stories that we presented before a task. In the imperative group, we told participants, imagine that you're a master thief executing a heist at an art museum. You're searching through the museum to find the most valuable art. Steal as much valuable art as you can before you run out of time. So we're really trying to emphasize urgency here. In contrast, in the interrogative group, we told participants, imagine that you're a master thief planning a heist and scouting an art museum. You're exploring the museum to find the most valuable art so you can steal it later. Discover valuable paintings for your future heist. So in this story here, we're instead emphasizing curious exploration and more future-oriented goals. So we randomly assigned participants to read one of these two cover stories, and then they did the exact same reinforcement learning task. On each trial, they saw 4 colored doors that represented different rooms of the museum. And they could choose a door to view one trial-unique painting from that room and learn the value of that painting. That process repeated for 100 trials with unique paintings every time. And importantly, we told them that some rooms have more valuable collections of art. So if they find one high-value painting now, they're likely to continue finding more high-value paintings as they sample. And they're all incentivized to find those valuable paintings because the money that they earn in this task determines a real bonus payment that they get to take home in the future. The next day, we brought them back for a surprise memory test. Here, we showed them some paintings and had them determine if they were old, meaning they had seen them before in the art museum task, or if they were new, meaning they hadn't seen them before. And I want to emphasize here that their performance on this memory test did not determine their bonus payment. So nobody was informed up front that we were going to test memory, and they get that bonus that they earned no matter what based on their performance on day 1. So the valuable paintings that they found within the reinforcement learning task. Finally, at the very end, they all get paid and they get that bonus payment, which was determined by the paintings they found during the art heist. And so I want to emphasize here that the only difference between these two conditions was that story that they read at the very beginning. Everyone has the same tutorial, the same tasks. They all understand sort of the compensation structure that results from this work. Okay. So one way that we can look at trial-by-trial choices that people make is to use reinforcement learning models. I'm not going to go into details of our model construction here, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But in brief, we fit a pretty standard reinforcement learning model, and we can use that to classify choices that people make. We call a choice exploitation if they choose the door with the highest estimated value. So based on what you've seen so far, which door should you think is the most valuable? If you go right for that valuable one, that's exploitation. We call it directed exploitation exploration if they choose the door with the highest uncertainty. So because the reward values slowly drift over time in this task, if you haven't chosen a door in a long time, you should be more uncertain about how value. And finally, we call it random exploration if they choose one of the other two doors. So it's neither the best in terms of earning money, nor the best in terms of resolving uncertainty. You're kind of just choosing randomly. Our first key question was whether these motivational states would shift choice strategies during reinforcement learning. Turning to our results here, first looking at those choice types. So we're focusing on that reinforcement learning task here. The second was a pre-registered replication. The task was exactly the same, so for all findings, I'm just going to show the results side by side for easy comparison. On the x-axis here, we'll look at the three choice types that I just described: exploitation, directed exploration, and random exploration. And on the y-axis, we'll look at the number of choices that participants made, comparing our two groups, imperative and interrogative. In both samples, we found that participants in the imperative group engaged in more exploitation during this task, so they're more often choosing to try to maximize reward. In contrast, participants in the interrogative group were more likely to engage in directed exploration in both samples. But crucially, there's no difference between the two groups when it comes to random exploration. So that tells us that it's not that the interrogative folks just don't understand the task and are choosing at random, but rather they're strategically choosing in a way that helps them to resolve uncertainty. So overall, we see more exploitation in the imperative group and more directed exploration in the interrogative group. Next, we looked at whether this difference in choice behavior might translate into differences in performance. So how many points are they earning? And remember, this determines how much money they actually get to take home. So on the x-axis here, we'll compare our two groups, and on the y-axis, we'll look at the total number of points that they earned, or the value of all the paintings that they found in the task. And in both samples, we found that participants in the imperative group earned more points during reward learning. So they're objectively doing better at this reinforcement learning task according to this particular performance metric. Returning to our question here, we find that these motivational states are influencing choice strategies and that has consequences for how much money they get to take home. But we were really interested in whether these motivational states might lead to differences in memory performance the next day. On the x-axis here, we'll again compare our two conditions, and on the y-axis, we'll now look at recognition memory accuracy for the paintings that they encountered in the art museum task. And I want to emphasize here that we are focusing on the paintings because we think this is a measure of associative memory that might be particularly sensitive to these differences in motivational states. So the paintings themselves are totally incidental. They don't actually inform their choices because the value in the door choice is what really matters for performance in the task. So we're looking at this incidental associative encoding. Okay, and in both samples, we find that participants in the interrogative group show better memory performance for those paintings the next day. But we also looked at whether there were differences in how reward is influencing memory. On the x-axis here, we'll look at the reward value for each painting. I'll be plotting estimates from linear mixed effects regression models. And on the y-axis, we'll look at recognition memory accuracy for a given painting as a function of reward value. First, looking at the interrogative group, you see these blue lines are slanted upward in both samples, indicating that the higher value a particular painting, the more likely people are to remember it the next day. Not surprising, this certainly replicates prior findings, indicating that reward can enhance memory formation. But in contrast, in the imperative group, we see that this effect has been disrupted. So not only do they have worse memory performance on average, but it's actually driven by the fact that they're no longer prioritizing those high-value paintings in memory in an adaptive way that we might expect. So returning to our question here, as expected, we find that the next day, participants in the interrogative group had better memory for those paintings. I hear some mic sound. Did someone have a question, or was that just an unmuting incident? Okay, seems like no questions, so I'll keep going. So to sum up so far, we showed that a subtle cover story manipulation, planning versus executing an art heist, led to this trade-off, biasing immediate choices in the moment as well as long-term memory. In the imperative group, we see more exploitation and more points earned as a result, whereas in the interrogative group, we see more directed exploration to resolve uncertainty and better recognition memory the next day. But what might be happening in the brain to support these effects? We were interested in whether these motivational states would engage distinct neural systems. Thinking back to the theoretical framework that I shared up front, we predicted that imperative motivation would be supported by noradrenergic modulation coming from the locus coeruleus and engaging regions like the amygdala. And in contrast, we expected that interrogative motivation would be associated with dopaminergic modulation from the VTA, particularly supporting encoding of associative relationships in the hippocampus. So what I'm going to share next is just a couple of featured findings from a recent fMRI study that we did where we adapted this paradigm to do in the scanner. There's a lot more that I could share from this. I'm just going to share a couple of highlights for the sake of time. But let's take a look at whether these motivational states are associated with activation in these different neuromodulatory systems. So first, taking a look at what's happening in the brain during this feedback phase. So participants have just chosen a door during the reinforcement learning task in the scanner, and now they're viewing the painting and the value associated with it. And I'm going to focus here on activation in the locus coeruleus, or LC, which is a key noradrenergic hub. On the x-axis here, we'll look at the trial-by-trial strength of activation in the LC, and on the y-axis, we'll look at the predicted probability of remembering a specific painting the next day. And what we see is that in the imperative group, participants who showed greater activation of the LC on a given trial were more likely to forget that specific painting the next day. In contrast, in the interrogative group, we don't see that relationship, so there's no memory impairment that's associated with LC engagement. What I'm showing here are the average estimates from mixed effects models, but we can also look at the random slopes by participant. If we do that in the imperative group, you can see that this effect is pretty consistent, so most participants are showing this downward slope, whereas in the interrogative group, we're really not seeing any consistent relationship between LC and memory. So overall, we're seeing that in the imperative group selectively, this trial-by-trial LC activation is predicting worse memory performance, which is helping to explain that overall memory deficit that we observe. Still looking at the feedback phase here, but now we're going to take a look at what's going on in the ventral tegmental area, this dopaminergic hub. On the x-axis here, I'll plot averages for our two conditions, and this time we'll be looking at the effect of a parametric modulation by reward. So how much is activation in the VTA going up and down in accordance with the reward value of a particular painting during this encoding phase, where they're viewing this painting in the And we find that participants in the interrogative group show significantly stronger representations of reward in the VTA during this phase where they're receiving feedback and encoding a painting, which is consistent with the idea of dopaminergic modulation that might support that reward prioritization of memory. Returning to our question here, we find some preliminary new fMRI data that these motivational states are indeed associated with activation in some of these key neuromodulatory regions. So to sum up across our studies here, we showed that imperative motivation was associated with more exploitation and better reward earnings, but at the cost of worse memory the next day, particularly for those associative details. And we show that activation in the LC is associated with that memory impairment effect, consistent with the idea of noradrenergic modulation. In contrast, interrogative motivation was associated with more directed exploration to resolve uncertainty and enhanced memory the next day, particularly for those high-value paintings. And with our fMRI data, we see stronger representations of reward in the VTA during that encoding phase, consistent with the idea of dopaminergic modulation. In terms of theoretical implications here, we show that these motivational states bias choices in memory, and those effects can transcend that threat versus reward dichotomy. So there are multiple strategies we might potentially use to induce those motivational states. And in terms of practical implications, these motivational states could support either immediate action in the moment or learning in service of future goals, which is relevant to education as well as to behavior change. In the second part of my talk today, I'll apply some insights from study one here to a new set of studies where we looked at how the affective framing of news shapes engagement and memory. Here, I'll be sharing some findings from these studies, which you can find online as a preprint. This is some of my postdoc work that I've done working with Emily Falk here at Penn. Now, we know from many prior studies that negative stimuli capture attention and evoke physiological arousal. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, negative news is often found to be more likely to be read and shared widely online. But this negativity bias can come at a cost. Negative news consumption has been linked to negative affect and poor mental health outcomes in daily life. In particular, in the context of climate change, there's an ongoing debate about whether our messaging about climate should emphasize negative consequences or, alternatively, more hopeful futures. On one hand, using negative framing could increase reading and sharing, which might help spread information across social networks, which in turn could change social norms and help us address this problem. But there's mixed evidence suggesting that negative framing could encourage or potentially discourage action to address the problem. For example, if people feel hopeless, they might not be motivated. And again, dipping into the memory literature here, we see that negative stimuli can have complex effects on memory. It can enhance our memory for focal details that were directly the central point of that threat, but it can also bias memory and details that were surrounding it. On the other hand, positive framing could have other benefits. It's been shown to increase positive affect and hope related to climate change, and in turn, those positive emotions predict policy support. And other studies have shown that positive framing about climate change can increase collective efficacy and motivate collective action. In these studies, we address this debate from the perspective of thinking about these motivational states that I previously introduced. So we might predict that imperative motivation could help spur immediate goal-directed behavior, but memory for peripheral details. And I want to note that the memory outcomes here are particularly relevant because prior studies have shown that when we have weaker or biased memory representations of news, it leaves us vulnerable to misinformation that we encounter in the future. On the other hand, looking at interrogative motivation, we might predict that it would drive exploratory information seeking, so that could potentially be another way to increase engagement. And we might expect that it would also enhance detailed memory formation to help us form these lasting detailed associative memories. So in this study, to test these predictions, we took a set of news headlines about climate change, and we created alternate versions of those headlines. Here's an example of one of those stories. In the crisis condition, we tried to evoke more of an imperative motivation mindset where we reframed these headlines to really emphasize crisis and urgency. For example, saying communities are being threatened by storms and rising seas, or emphasizing destruction. In contrast, in the opportunity framing condition, we tried to evoke interrogative motivation by instead trying to highlight more rewarding or positive future outcomes. And oftentimes this doesn't mean sugarcoating an issue or hiding the fact that there's a challenge, but rather emphasizing what people are doing to address it and what might become in the future. We had a few predictions. First, we expected that crisis and opportunity framing could potentially both increase engagement by evoking these strong affective responses. But we also expected a trade-off, similar to what we saw in the prior studies that I shared. We thought that crisis framing might have stronger effects on immediate behavior, but opportunity framing could lead to better memory for news content the next day. We conducted 2 experiments. The second was pre-registered. In the first, we focused on framing effects on affect and engagement. And in the second, we replicated those findings, and we also extended our paradigm to look at donations and subsequent memory outcomes. These studies were very similar methodologically and in terms of the results, so for the sake of time today, I'm going to show you the methods and results interleaved from 2 studies. Okay, on each trial, we showed participants a little news article snippet like this. They see an image, a headline, and a lead sentence, and we had them provide a number of different ratings about each little article. How much they would like to read the full-length article, their intentions to share that article on social media, the strength of positive affect that they feel in response, and the strength of negative affect. After they'd had a chance to provide those ratings for all of the news articles in our stimulus set, we gave them a chance to make real charitable donations to related causes. For example, they would see all the little thumbnails of the news articles, again, all on the same page this time so they could scroll through them. We gave them a small endowment of a few dollars, and they could choose to keep some or all of that money for themselves as a bonus. So if they chose to give it away, they could use these sliding scales from 0 to 100% next to each of the article headlines to allocate their funding. So they could give, say, 30% to this cause, 20% to another, and maybe they keep the rest of the money for themselves, and so on and so forth. And I want to note that these were real donations, so if they didn't donate, they got to keep it as a bonus. If they did donate, we actually gave to these charities on their behalf. Finally, the next day, we brought them back for a surprise memory test about the articles. In the text recognition phase, we showed them 3 text variants of the headline, and they tried to remember which version they had seen before. And in the image recognition phase, we showed them 5 different images that were drawn from the full text of each original article, so they're all topically relevant, and they tried to remember which image they had seen paired with the headline. Our first question was whether positive and negative affect ratings would be related to engagement, and if so, whether they would have similar or different effects. On the x-axis here, we'll look at the affect ratings that participants provided. These are z-scored, so stronger ratings here indicate stronger affect. And on the y-axis for each plot, we'll look at our different measures of engagement, so reading intentions, sharing intentions, and real donations to those charities. And I'll plot separate lines here to compare negative and positive valence. And what we found was that both positive and negative affect had a positive relationship, so participants who reported stronger affect were more likely to want to read the full-length article. We see the same effect again when we look at sharing intentions, and the same effect again when we look at those donations. So overall, we see that positive and negative affect ratings were both associated with increased reading, sharing, and donating. Returning to our question here, we see this relationship across all of our measures of engagement, and we find that positive and negative affect had very similar effects. But next, we wanted to see how crisis and opportunity framing within each news story might influence affect and engagement. On the x-axis here, we'll compare our 3 message framing conditions. In the middle is the control condition. These were the original headlines as they were actually published. We're using this as our control in order to maximize ecological validity. On the left, we'll look at opportunity framing versions, and on the right, we'll look at crisis framing. On the y-axis here, first looking at positive affect evoked by the headlines, we see that opportunity framing increased positive affect relative to control, whereas crisis framing decreased it. If we look at negative affect on the right side plot, we see the exact mirror flipped pattern, so not surprising, but good to confirm. Opportunity framing is making people feel better, crisis framing is making people feel worse. But we were really interested in how framing would influence engagement. So same plot setup as before, we've got our 3 framing conditions down here, and on the y-axis we'll look at the effect of framing on reading, sharing, and donating. We found that both opportunity and crisis framing increased intentions to read the articles, and we see the same effect again for sharing intentions. In contrast, for donations, we see a more selective effect where only crisis framing significantly increased donations. So overall, we see that crisis and opportunity framing both increased reading and sharing intentions, and I'll note here that those framing effects were also mediated by those continuous affect ratings. But it's important to note as well that crisis framing had the strongest effects overall on immediate engagement. So across the board here, you'll see that the red dots are the highest, and of course, crisis framing has this more selective effect on increasing donations. Returning to our key question here, we see that crisis and opportunity framing have very different effects on affect, but relatively similar effects on engagement. Finally, we wanted to see whether these framing strategies would have opposing effects on memory for news content the next day. On the x-axis, we'll again compare our 3 framing conditions, and on the y-axis, we'll look at text recognition accuracy on the left plot and image recognition on the right plot. We found opportunity framing enhanced memory for the text of the news articles above control and crisis, whereas in contrast, crisis framing selectively impaired memory for the images that were associated with those headlines. So we see overall better memory under an opportunity, and particularly we're seeing that this crisis framing is impairing memory for these peripheral associated details, the images that were paired with the text. So returning to our question here, as expected, we find that crisis and opportunity framing have different effects on memory the next day. Finally, we wanted to see whether some of these effects might generalize to a real-world news context. So thinking back, we showed that positive and negative affect, those continuous ratings, were both associated with greater reading and sharing intentions. But what about in the real world? Here, we see some competing predictions from prior work. For example, some studies have shown that negative affect alone drives reading and sharing online, and some of these studies have even shown that positive affect has an inverse effect, decreasing reading. Whereas in contrast, other studies have proposed that evoking strong emotions, either negative or positive, can drive reading and sharing. So to test these predictions in the context of climate change, we did a field study with social media. I used a large language model that was validated with human ratings to score the affective framing of over 25,000 news headlines about climate change that we found on Twitter or X. These are collected over about a 10-year period, and they're all coming from about a dozen major news outlets on Twitter. On the x-axis here, we'll look at the message framing now as a continuous score ranging from 0, very negative, to 10, very positive. 5 in the middle is neutral. And on the y-axis, we'll look at the number of reposts, or how many times these news articles were actually shared on social media. And on the right plot, we'll look at the number of likes that it received. And what we see are these beautiful U-shaped functions. The black line here is indicating the average across news outlets, whereas the gray lines are indicating random slopes for individual news outlets. So this U-shaped function indicates that news headlines that were rated as far more negative or far more positive were much more likely to be shared on social media relative to more neutral headlines about climate change. On the right plot, looking at likes, we again see this beautiful U-shaped function, although I'll note here we see some more interesting differences in terms of differences across news outlets. So I've labeled a couple of these gray slopes that are significantly different from the others. You'll notice that this U-shaped function is tilted in some cases. So the New York Times is showing a positivity bias in likes, whereas Fox News is showing a negativity bias. So this is sort of indicating that although overall we might see this U-shaped function, it does differ across audiences. So to sum up across our studies here, we showed that positive and negative affect ratings were both positively associated with reading intentions, sharing intentions, and charitable donations. We see that crisis and opportunity framing both increased reading and sharing, although crisis framing had the strongest effects overall. Now, in order to reconcile these two bullet points here, looking at the continuous affect ratings versus the discrete crisis framing, framing effects, it's important to note that it can be easier to evoke strong negative affect, potentially, particularly when it comes to climate change. So, for example, when we do successfully evoke really strong positive affect with opportunity framing, it might be just as potent as crisis framing in terms of engagement, but on average, it's harder to do that. And so we see this overall advantage for crisis framing. And finally, we also see a trade-off whereby crisis framing led to the greatest immediate engagement effects, particularly for sharing and for donations, whereas opportunity framing enhanced memory for news content the next day. In terms of theoretical implications, we applied predictions from this theory of motivation to a new domain and also to a new timescale, looking at these momentary engagement with real-world news headlines. And this can help to reconcile some contradictory findings from prior work on affect and information consumption. And in terms of practical implications, we know that negativity is engaging, but also potentially very harmful for mental health. And so we show that highlighting opportunity is a promising alternative that can still increase engagement and support long-term memory formation. And that's particularly relevant to challenges like climate change in the news. In the last few minutes here, I'll summarize across the two sections and highlight some future directions and what we're currently working on. To sum up, in part one, I showed that motivational states shifted the balance between short-term reward learning and longer-term memory formation. And in study two, I showed that changing the affective framing of news headlines influenced information consumption and donations in the moment, as well as subsequent memory. Taken together, these findings indicate this sort of broader theoretical framework where there are multiple levers that we might pull in order to induce these different motivational states. For example, imperative motivation could be induced by threat or urgency, as well as highly salient immediate goals. In contrast, interrogative motivation could be induced by reward, as well as future-oriented goals or intrinsic curiosity about a topic. And we also looked at the outcomes or the consequences of these motivational states. So imperative motivation is associated with more focused attention and encoding, catalyzes immediate goal-directed behavior, and we see that it drives people towards more exploitative choices in the context of reward learning. In contrast, we see that interrogative motivation is associated with directed exploration to resolve uncertainty, information seeking, and enriched associative memory the next day. Taken together, these findings support the idea of a trade-off where imperative and interrogative states have different pros and cons. So it's not that one is inherently better than the other, but rather that by being intentional about matching our cognitive processes to a particular context can help us achieve our goals. If you're interested in learning more about the predictions and recent evidence supporting this theoretical framework, you can check out this wonderful review paper that just came out hot off the press like a couple of weeks ago. This is from Jahao Po and Alison Adcock. A couple of open questions that I'm interested to explore. So far, we focused it on more transient motivational states, either on the timescale of half an hour or so to just a minute or two while you're reading a news headline. But what about more stable trait level individual differences? In some of these prior studies, we've collected individual differences data, and we see some interesting effects where, for example, anxiety and perfectionism are associated with more imperative-like behavior, suggesting that people might follow along a continuum based on their sort of trait-level characteristics, and we can nudge them towards one end of the spectrum or the other with these state-level interventions, but everyone has their own starting point. I'm also interested in exploring this idea of timescales further. So there might be shared or potentially distinct neural systems that support brief versus prolonged responses to motivational stimuli. For example, in part one, I shared this art heist task where we induce a state and prolong it throughout the task that people complete. Whereas in this news consumption task, participants are potentially switching between these motivational states from news article to news article. And finally, food for thought. We spend most of our lives in imperative contexts. So although that can have benefits in the moment, it could potentially be harmful in the long term or simply sort of wrecking the balance that we might be seeking. So thinking about how we can create learning or media environments that support curious exploration could facilitate a balance between these different motivational states, given that we know that there are benefits to either. Finally, to highlight some current work that we're doing, I'm right about to launch a new fMRI study right now where we're extending this news engagement paradigm that I shared in part two. We've expanded our stimulus set to 60 articles, and we're now looking at both climate-related and health-related information to generalize across domains. We're interested in testing hypotheses about these neuromodulatory systems and how they predict choices and future memory, as well as using RSA to tease apart these multidimensional layers of these naturalistic stimuli. For example, we can look at emotional valence and arousal, as well as perceived self or social relevance of the information, valuation in the form of these donation decisions, and the semantic similarity across different news headlines. To leave you with a final take-home idea, we show that motivational states bias choices, information seeking, and memory formation. And we also showed that changing the framing of a task or news story can curate that cognitive context. So it's within our power to shape our cognition in this way through harnessing motivation. With that, I want to give thanks to the people who contributed to this work. My collaborators in part one were Alison Adcock and Candice Wong back at Duke. And in part two were Emily Falk, Danny Cosme, and Jose Carreras-Tartak. This work was supported by funding from the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences and the Annenberg Public Policy Center. And I myself have been supported from fellowships for the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. With that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. So we will open the floor for questions. Thank you so much, Allie. So if you go ahead and raise your virtual hand, we'll just go through. I'll try to do it based on when I see them, and then I'll ask you to unmute and you can ask your question, or you can put it in the chat and I'll ask it aloud. Yes, Corinna.
So fascinating work, also well-timed with respect to the art heist. I think we can all agree that the folks in the Louvre were actually in imperative mode.
Yeah, they were in and out. They were definitely urgent. Yeah.
Yeah, so love this work. I'm wondering whether you have any more like evidence of individual differences, right? So in those samples that you were using, in particular, of course, I'm interested in, given my own work, I'm interested in age. And we know that there are, of course, age differences in framing effects, also in potentially in amygdala reactivity. Also, I'm thinking that the findings on Fox News and New York Times reminded me of findings that show that the amygdala seems to be more sensitive and political conservative. So I'm wondering whether you have any evidence of individual differences along those lines or others in your data.
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of age, we've so far focused on younger adults, but I completely agree that I would predict really interesting age differences. So that's definitely a direction that I would like to explore in the future, especially with the work that I shared in part two with the framing effects. I would definitely expect to see some differences among older adults there. You raise a great point with like greater threat sensitivity or greater amygdala responsiveness in conservatives. That could potentially explain these differences that we see across news outlets. If we look at sort of the media leaning scores for these different outlets, we do see that more conservative leaning outlets tend to have these more negative biases in terms of engagement. But it's also a little tricky because at least in the context of climate change, it's also confounded with like the type of news that the news outlets are putting out. So for example, the kinds of headlines climate change that Fox News often not saying, oh, climate change is a threat to the planet, but rather, these damn liberal politicians are, blah, blah, engineering this climate hoax, like something that might be eliciting anger or negative emotions, but in a way that might be very different from the way that, say, the New York Times would have a negatively framed headline about climate change. So I think it would be interesting to extend that work and look at individual differences in political ideology, but also to look at sort of a more controlled way of, varying, making sure that the wording, like the content itself, is consistent, but the framing itself is different. That is something that we can look at in our current study. We do have political ideology measures. I have not explored those individual differences, but I think it'd be really interesting to. Ideally, we would do another sample that's politically representative. These were prolific participants recruited online, and their population tends to skew liberal. So I think that we probably don't have very many conservatives, which makes it a bit hard to look at individual differences.
Other questions? Yeah, Michael.
Hey, so yeah, this was a really cool talk. I really enjoyed hearing about all of the other work that you had. So I've been thinking about similar ideas that I haven't really been able to test yet. But so I have some work with misinformation, and
Hmm.
especially with some hypothetical negative news stories and then corrections and looking at continued influence effects
Hmm.
in a political context. But I've also thought about and actually we also had some evidence that basically um, people have better memory for the accusations than for the
Mm. Oh,
corrections.
very interesting.
Um, but I've thought that like these dynamics of like maybe the negative misinformation is narrowing the focus, and it almost might make it that people are less responsive to the corrections at that point because it's just like, oh my God, this person did something terrible, and
Hmm.
like you can't even think about the bigger picture. I mean, I've also thought about aging implications potentially, where like maybe older adults, especially older adults, maybe in the early. This is a little bit of a complicated hypothesis that I don't know if there's any direct evidence for yet, but that like the perirhinal cortex is like
Hmm.
the first area that declines in older
Hmm.
adults. As I understand it, that's more tied in with the amygdala and the
Hmm.
noradrenergic system. And
Hmm.
so it's like, oh, well, maybe even though older adults in general are able to detect
Oh.
fake news, maybe when it's really emotional, maybe they're going to be particularly inclined to like really zoom in on these negative details. And again, so I'm just kind of curious any of your thoughts about any of those directions, because I think it really aligns well with what you're doing.
Yeah, very interesting. I share your enthusiasm for all of that. And just to add one more thing that's been on my mind, I would be interested in looking at whether these framing effects would extend to source memory, because I think that's particularly relevant to true versus false information and like keeping those separate. And I would predict that source memory would fall in the category of like the kind of associative details that might be lost when we enter this imperative state. And I think it would be really interesting to look at whether that might be exacerbated in older adults.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Kim.
Right. Allie, really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your talk. So one of the things that I'm thinking of as you're showing your data and then, thinking about the framework more broadly is
Mhm.
I'm curious what you think about sort of like bu bundling. because when we're thinking about imperative and interrogative, and often they're sort of aligned with reward and threat type perspectives, if not direct incentives per se. We're kind of like looking at these in different ways. I would started to think about this because you have both a measure of reported positive affect as well as a measure of negative affect. And I was kind of interested in whether you saw situations in your climate study, or if you've pursued this in other work, where people sort of have mixed emotions or the presence of both positive and negative affect, and the extent to which you think that might have bearing on the motivational orientation, or whether, in the presence of both positive and negative affect, if you have some sort of like conflict or mixed feelings that might guide how the motivational orientation plays out and then subsequent behavior.
Yeah, great question. We've thought about that too, and that's in fact exactly why we chose to measure positive and negative affect separately in that study, because we thought that people might potentially have pretty
Yeah,
mixed feelings about it, where it's like,
sure.
oh, this is terrible. Oh, but I'm hopeful that they might be able to do something about it, right? So like those can potentially be experienced at the same time. We do often see that people, sort of swing to one side or the other depending on valence, and of course that's heavily influenced by framing. But yeah, there are cases where people are, like both of these things are going up, as opposed to it being like zero positive affect and all negative affect and so on. One interesting precedent there would be some studies that have been done by Lauren Feldman and Saul Hart, where they looked at sort of they call it like efficacy instead of opportunity framing, but something similar where it's like a crisis version and an opportunity version. And then they also had a condition that combined them, so they stacked it. And what they see is that they were more interested in just emotional responses. And what they show is that when they combine it, you do in fact evoke both emotions concurrently. And then that can in turn translate into things like policy support or other attitudes or beliefs related to climate change. They haven't looked at memory outcomes or anything like that, but I would be really interested to see, if you do that kind of combined messaging intervention where you evoke both emotions, are they mutually exclusive, or can they potentially be both contributing to memory? That would be really interesting. Maybe there is a win-win solution where you could have immediate engagement as well as memory enhancement, but I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, hi. Greetings from the Netherlands. A great talk. I really liked your slides. They were super clear. I don't have a question per se, but I guess maybe more a comment of someone who is not an expert in this. But what might be interesting for you to look at is, I assume that there might already be neuro research onto uses and gratifications theory, which is more like the communication media-based theory of how people engage with media and news outlets. And I know they have research on people selectively gravitating towards different types of outlets or media content. And I do assume that there's also research that looks into the neuro underpinnings, but I don't do any neuro research myself, so I'm very uninformed of what that might be. I just thought that might be helpful because I also currently research age differences and confirmation bias in the context of climate change. So I am aware of this communication literature that kind of bypasses us in, say, for example, psych research. And I just thought that might be a good pointer if that is not something that's on your radar yet.
Thank you so much for that suggestion. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that literature, so I definitely like to look into it. I focused more on, the work on like what sort of like message features or sort of emotional qualities might drive people to engage with information, as opposed to how they might seek like particular types of information from particular outlets. So I think that's really interesting.
Other questions? While we're waiting, I was just wondering about the breakdown of your in-person versus online group. So how many of them were the prolific participants, and how many was it just the fMRI ones that were in person?
Only the fMRI studies are in person. Everything else was prolific participants recruited online.
Great. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Hi, thanks so much. That was really interesting. I had a question regarding your first part, which is a little bit more technical, but I wondered about the recognition measures, whether you've also looked into whether people might have some response tendencies or whether it's their memory sensitivity. So I was just wondering, is it a true memory phenomenon, or is it something where people respond differently depending on the condition?
Yeah, great question. You're talking about part one with the art museum
Yeah,
heist, right? Okay.
given
Yeah, so we did also do
the current Louvre events, I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, so we did also do some like signal detection theory type analyses with the memory data there. So we can look at, for example, like D prime to look at whether there's just like a general response bias. We do see similar effects there where like D prime is greater in the interrogative group than in the imperative group, suggesting that even when you correct for, response biases that they might have, we still see this memory enhancement. But the effects are stronger and like doing the trial level analyses that I did, it doesn't account for sort of that general responding, but it does help us reveal this effect of reward enhancing memory, which I think is important to the story too. But yeah, we share your concern and did look at response
Oh, it's not a
biases.
concern. I was really more curious about it.
Also, you didn't ask, but we also looked at whether there were response biases in the memory test for the news engagement work, because we were wondering whether people might just sort of preferentially want to endorse negative or positive or neutral framed news headlines. Interestingly, they don't. They are actually all about equally endorsed, but the accuracy differs across them, which is interesting.
Interesting. Maybe just a quick follow-up regarding you mentioned you're also becoming more interested in traits. I just wondered, have you thought about measuring? I mean, there are scales for prevention, promotion, or approach, avoidance, motivation, whether you have some data already in this direction.
Yeah, we collected like BISBAS, like reward sensitivity measures and didn't find any individual differences there in the past. I can't remember if we included like regulatory focus measures previously. I don't think we did, but we are going to include it in the new fMRI study that will be with the framing of the news headlines. And I would expect that we might see individual differences there, where, for example, if someone generally has more of like a prevention focus, then they might respond more to the sort of crisis framed headlines as opposed to opportunity framing might align better with someone who generally has a disposition towards promotion framing.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Kim.
Sorry, you basically already said this, Allie, but I was going to say make sure to, I would encourage you to take a look at those trait measures in an interaction with your framing manipulation. Because we had some like preliminary data in my art museum study, which doesn't
Actually,
have
the real art museum, yeah.
it doesn't have all of the, beautiful nuances in terms of like mapping out the exploratory behavior and stuff, but we did see some trait manipulation interactions there. So I would be excited to see if you're able to map some stuff out in your follow-up.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. Do you remember off the top of your head, like which trait measures were predictive? If not, I can go back to the paper because I know what you're talking
We
about.
had both BISBAS as well as RFQ, promotion prevention, and
okay.
I think it was promotion prevention. So
Okay. Yeah, I'm
you
getting
can
a little
see
sick
that.
of putting BISBAS in because I've never found it to be related to anything in any of these studies,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
someone
I mean,
can change my mind if they have
just
found it.
anecdotally, we've seen BISBAS come out more in cognitive control outcomes
Yes.
than motivated memory. And I don't know if there's something about like the temporal proximity or maybe like
Maybe. Hmm.
an immediate control task is sort of imperative by nature. But in case that's an interesting anecdote, feel free to contact me if you have questions after looking at the paper.
Great.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, then I think we'll thank Allie for a wonderful talk. And we will be back on Tuesday, November 11th for Dr. Corinna Lockenhoff's talk on aging differences in decision-making, a conceptual framework. I think it's the same time for the Europeans, but it's an hour earlier for the North Americans, if that makes sense. All right. Well, let us know if you have any feedback, and otherwise we will see you then.
Thank you all. It was great to meet you and great to share this work, and thanks for the interesting discussion as well.
Thanks so much, Allie.
Bye.